Have you ever just wished you could see the future? I mean, it's this universal fascination, this deep down desire to know what's coming around the corner. And that's what pulls so many of us into the world of prophecy. But what if the whole point of biblical prophecy wasn't just about getting a sneak peek of the future, but about understanding our place in a much, much bigger story? So let's get into it.
I mean, that's the ultimate question, isn't it? Just imagine having the script for tomorrow, or for next year, or even the next century. I mean, who wouldn't want that kind of certainty? But when we turn to these ancient texts, we find out pretty quickly that prophecy, well, it operates on a totally different level.
And really, that's our starting point right there. You see, according to scholars, the purpose of prophecy is so much deeper than just scratching an itch about the future. It's given to us in the context of history, a history that's moving toward this grand conclusion, and it's meant to change how we live right now. So, to really get it, we first have to bust a couple of pretty common myths.
Okay, so the first big misconception comes from a pretty critical viewpoint, that prophecy is basically just a clever trick. It's this idea that all these so-called predictions were actually written after the events happened. You know, just dressed up to look like a forecast. But when you really dig into the literary style, that whole argument starts to fall apart.
What's so fascinating here is just how different these two styles of writing are. I mean, look at historical writing, like what you find in the books of Kings. It is jam-packed with details, all laid out in a nice, neat chronological order. Prophecy, though, it's the complete opposite. It gives you these really striking, important details, but it leaves out all the connecting stuff. It has what scholars call an enigmatic or puzzling character.
And this quote from A. Berkeley Mickelson just nails it. Think about it. To write a history book but make it look like a prophecy, you'd have to intentionally forget half of what you know. You'd have to scramble the timeline on purpose. The very thing that makes prophecy feel so mysterious, the fact that it's selective and not in order, is actually one of the strongest arguments that it's not just history written in disguise.
Okay, so if it's not history written about the past, then it has to be the opposite, right? It must be a perfect, super detailed history of the future, all written down in advance. Well, this is the second myth, and this one's a little more subtle.
It's a really tempting idea, isn't it? It would mean we have a perfect roadmap of everything that's going to happen, no more uncertainty. But once again, that enigmatic character of prophecy tells us something completely different. It's not a detailed script. So here's the crucial thing to get. Prophecy doesn't give you the whole picture, but it gives you just enough detail so that when the fulfillment happens, you can recognize it. But, and this is a huge but, that fulfillment almost always arrives with twists and turns that nobody saw coming. Let's look at a classic example of this.
We're going to jump in a time machine and go all the way back to the 8th century BC, to the prophet Isaiah. The northern parts of Israel, regions called Zebulun and Naphtali, were in a really dark place. They had been totally devastated by an Assyrian invasion. And right into this darkness, Isaiah speaks a prophecy. He predicts that in this specific war-torn part of the country, a great light is going to show up one day and just get rid of all the gloom. Now, for the people hearing this back then, it was a message of hope for the future, for sure. But it was super vague on the details. Like, who or what is this light, and when is it coming?
Okay, now let's fast forward over 700 years. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that Jesus begins his public ministry. And where does he start? In Capernaum, right in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali. And Matthew is explicit about it. He says this happened to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. The location, a perfect match.
And this is so key. Isaiah didn't say, a man named Jesus is going to show up in 700 years. Nope. The prophecy had that enigmatic quality we've been talking about. It gave a recognizable pattern. A great light will show up in this dark land. But it wasn't a detailed blueprint. The fulfillment was crystal clear looking back, but it was also full of surprises. This all leads us to another really important principle for understanding prophecy, how the prophets actually see and describe time. It's not like looking at a calendar. It's way more like looking at a giant mountain range from really, really far away. This analogy is so incredibly helpful. You know how it is, from a distance, two huge mountain peaks can look like they're right next to each other. But as you get closer, you realize there's this massive valley, miles and miles wide, that separates them. Well, that's the prophetic perspective. Events that seem to happen one right after the other in the text can actually be separated by huge stretches of time.
This effect is called foreshortening, and it can create these enormous, hidden time gaps that you just don't see at first glance. And sometimes the gap can pop up in the most surprising place you can imagine, like right in the middle of a single sentence. Let's look at an absolutely dramatic example from Isaiah to see how this works. So Isaiah prophesies that a future anointed one is going to come and do two things, and they're connected by that little word "and." First, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and second, to proclaim the day of vengeance of our God. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Like two parts of the same event.
Okay, so now let's jump to the Gospel of Luke. Picture this. Jesus is in his hometown synagogue, he gets handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he reads this exact passage out loud. He reads about proclaiming good news to the poor and the year of the Lord's favor, and then he stops, cold, right in the middle of the verse. He rolls up the scroll, hands it back, and says, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." I mean, look at that. He deliberately splits the sentence right in two. He's claiming that first mountain peak, the year of the Lord's favor, was being fulfilled right then and there at his first coming. But he leaves that second peak, the day of vengeance, completely unread. Why? Because that was for a different time, a much different time.
So what about that valley between the two peaks? Well, it's been over 2,000 years, and it's still going. The Day of Vengeance is something that's associated with his second coming. This is the prophetic mountain range in action, a massive time gap hidden inside a single verse that was only revealed by its fulfillment. Wow.
So, we've talked about the style of prophecy, and we've talked about its perspective on time. But what about the actual words themselves? This brings us to what is maybe the toughest challenge of all for any interpreter. What in the world do we do when a prophecy is full of language and ideas from an ancient culture that's long gone?
You've got to remember, the prophets spoke in a way their original audience would totally understand. So they talked about transportation with horses and chariots. Their weapons were swords and bows. Their worship involved sacrifices at the temple, and their enemies were nations like Edom and Assyria. So if a prophecy using these terms is meant for a future way beyond their own time, how are we supposed to interpret all that?
Well, interpreters pretty much fall into three main camps on this. The first is the purely literal approach. If the text says horses, it means actual horses, period. The second is the spiritualizing approach, which sees these physical things as symbols for spiritual concepts. And the third is what's called the correspondence approach, which tries to find the modern-day equivalent. So bows and arrows become tanks and rockets. Let's look at an example of that spiritualizing approach.
So, you get a prophecy from Isaiah that, let's be honest, sounds an awful lot like a military campaign. Swoop down, plunder the people. It's battle language. But then you get an interpretation from a commentator like E.J. Young, and he sees this swooping down and plundering as something totally different. For him, it's not physical warfare, it's about the spread of the gospel through missionaries. The conquest is a spiritual one. You can see how that approach completely reframes the meaning of the text.
And all of this leaves us with one final and really crucial question. When we look at these ancient prophetic texts, what are we actually seeing? Is it a historical artifact, something locked into its own time with literal horses and chariots? Or is it a living message that speaks across the centuries using symbols and patterns? At the end of the day, how we choose to read the past profoundly shapes the future we expect to see.